So today what I want to do is talk about the login and that stuff again. And I've been going down the path of implementing login and registration and forgot email, all that stuff. I've been doing it. And rather than push forward and work through all the details, because it gets complicated and it's pretty extensive. And we do have time, but it's not, and it's a good exercise. And I've done it, in other environments. I've done it, several times. But maybe a more practical approach for you would be to use a library. So I did some research on that, and I think this passport.js is a good choice. And well, it's the most popular one anyway. So here it is, passport.js. Authentication for Node.js, so specifically for Node.js. And as far as I can tell, it's the most widely used. I'm expecting Eric to come today, so he was going to present on this semantic UI. So I wanted to get this done and give some time for him to do that. Semantic UI, I think that's a good topic to get into as well. So I went through this today, this morning, and I looked at this. And I was able to hammer together just a simple prototype of getting this running. And so I wanted to just show that to you, talk about that. So we got a choice here how to do this. Right, let's see if I can get a good picture of this. So with this, they talk about these authentication strategies. So basically it gives you a lot of options. So you can let the users log in, through their Google account, through their Facebook account, through GitHub account, through Twitter account. And there's a whole bunch of accounts. Like here it says 300 plus, more than 300 authentication strategies. I don't know why that shows as blocked there, but here they are. Facebook, all of these. This is Google. This is the one, this is where the user picks their own password and a username and email, and it's not done through a third party. So this is just you and the user. This is where you would do a registration. So passport-local, that's called the strategy. So when you think about implementing a web application and users have to authenticate, in the old days it was simple. Well, they had to type in a username, a password, and then they're in. Okay, that's authentication. But now it's different because of this third-party authentication, this stuff called OAuth, or OAuth 2 more recently. And you've got a third party, and you use that third party like an established business like Google or whatnot. And you've got already an account, it's your email, and you can authenticate through this third party rather than storing the password, in your own system and so on. That means that's convenient for the user. The user doesn't need to remember another password, right? They just log in through Facebook, click the link, and accept some permissions, and then they're in. And but now local passport local is the old-fashioned way. So all of these different mechanisms to authenticate, if it's Twitter, if it's Google, if it's a local login, these are called strategies in this package, this passport.js package. Those are referred to as strategies. So what I'll show you today is the local strategy. You can see there's a lot of strategies, and more than 300, they say. Right? So all of these things. This is Google, like WeChat. Instagram. You can authenticate through Instagram. You can authenticate through LinkedIn. I mean, 300 is a lot, right? So we don't have to go any farther than that. And so here's the documentation. It's not great, but I can figure it out. But it took some time. Now I can build this up a step at a time. Yeah. Multiple what? I got to get closer. Multiple. Yeah. So you can have your user authenticate through Facebook. Well, the user is only going to authenticate through one strategy. They're going to log in through Twitter, and that's it. Or they're going to log in through Facebook. That's it. They're not going to log in through another account. They're going to pick one. They're going to say, well, I don't use Facebook. Google account. I'll log in through Google. So you're giving them a choice. Oh, merge them together. In that case, yeah. I was just reading about that. So in that case, they have to log in through. If you want to get data from Twitter and Facebook, they have to log in through Twitter and Facebook, both. And then you can access their, whatever data they grant you, whatever privileges they grant you, then you can make use of that and present it back to them in your app. But that's not what I'm going to show today. That's where you're using data from that social networking site. You can find, if you can ask the user for permission to look at their friends list, and they say yeah. They go, oh great. So then you can list the friends in your website. You say, hey, those are my friends right there. And then but we're not going to talk about that. What I'm talking about now is a more narrow concern. And this is just authentication. You're not using Facebook to get any data. You're only using Facebook to make sure it's the same user every time. That's all. All right. So here we go. But I want to say that if that type of application where the users actually logging into multiple social networking sites and you sort of merge the information together, you make use of both of them. And then in that case, what you got is the user must authenticate through every social networking system that you want to use. And you can do that with this library. And I was reading about it today. And it's way down here on the bottom. Where is it? Authorize. So if you want to do multiple logins through different sites, then you use this authorize mechanism in this library. But I'm not going to get into that today. So here it said, for example, both Facebook and Twitter accounts. So you can log into both, be connected to both at the same time, bring in data from both, merge them, so on. It's fun when you start playing around with that. You get a lot of possibilities. Start connecting. So this is the time of web APIs, right? So there's APIs everywhere. I mean, GitHub is an API. So you can, GitHub and Facebook, and you could take that data from your users and somehow put it together and use it. And so there's a lot of interesting possibilities right now. Uh, so what I'll do, so Eric, I'm going to pass it over to you in just a minute, okay? So I told him about you were coming today. You're going to present on semantic UI. I'll let you get settled there and get ready. And I'm talking to them about passportjs. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Never gotten around to using it because, like, using when you use things like React and stuff, it's really complicated to roll out a user system because of the way React works.
Yeah. I got a strategy for doing that, and it's basically you implement the system without React first, and then you bring React in on top of it. That's one possible strategy, rather than trying to do everything all at once.
The main issue is that you need to find a way to have your interface not accessible at all to anybody who's not logged in.
Yeah.
Just by the way React works, the entire interface is accessible unless you use some other sort of thing with it.
Yeah.
And just the fact that all your code is compiled into a JavaScript thing, which
Yeah.
is sent to the makes it a little complicated.
Yeah.
You have to have like different routes stuff in the back end.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally.
There's even ways where you store the actual page data on the server
Yeah.
and it's sent to the React.
It's messy. It's complicated and messy, and there's a lot of details. And so my recommendation is to do what I'm doing, which is to put everything else aside. And my only dependency is Express. So, okay, I'm going to use Express, the passport. I'm going to see how it works. And that's what I did this morning. Let me show it to you. I want to show you what that looks like. And I don't have time to build it up step by step, so I can do that on another day if you're interested. But today I'm just going to show this to you. See, this is in Passport. So here's my my sample. So I have a main.js. I've got a public folder, just a favicon in there. And then I've got a views folder. I've got the layout, right? I got the layout. That's the layout. And, it's your typical layout. It's title with the, a variable to replace that and so on. And then I've got the, the home page here. And here's the form for logging in. I have to log in here. I've got a logout link. Got a login form, and you see this is a text box with the username, text box sort of password, and a submit button. And let me get that started. Start that up. Let's see what it looks like. There it is. That's the This is the login form, and I pre-populated it with with a valid username A and a valid password A. So I put that in there just for testing because I don't have to type it in all the time. I just hit login, and I log in. And it tells me hello A, and I should actually make this invisible. I don't need the login form anymore. So if you have a React, that makes it really easy to do. Or not really easy. It's nice to do in React, that sort of thing. And then there's the logout button. There we go. So how do we do that? Using Passport. And there's the Express module. Then we require Passport. And from Passport, well, there's each of those 300 plus strategies has its own module. So you're going to use npm install that strategy module, the module for that strategy. So the module that supports the normal username password login is passport-local, and then so that needs to be loaded. And then we have it uses sessions. We're going to use Express sessions, and then of course the body parser is needed, and then get an instance of Express. This is where we create an instance of this local strategy, and that becomes a middleware. So when we instantiate the local strategy, it becomes middleware, and we register that in Passport somehow. So actually, this must be acting as a router when I do this. All right, so Passport must implement a router because this use with the middleware. And so the local strategy takes a single argument. It's the single argument it takes is just a callback that's used to, it's going to say, I'll get a username and password from the user. But you got to tell me if the password is okay. I'm not going to figure that out. You got to figure that out. So we have to create the callback that takes the username and password so that the Passport module calls our callback and gives us the username and password that it got from the user. And this is where you would normally hit the database. But it's just a demonstration just to figure out how the library fits together. So we're going to leave the database out. We just check to see if the username is A and the password is A. So we're only accepting one user. And if that's good, if that's valid, then we call done. Now done gets passed into us. So it says, hey, look, here's the username. Here's the username. So that the module, the library gives us the username and password. It says, you check that for us. Check it for me. And then after you're finished, you can call done to let the library know whether it was a valid login or an invalid login. Now, if it's a valid login, you need to call this done function of passing a user object in as a second argument. Now, the first argument, by convention, is almost always used to pass error state. So normally you want to see null in that first slot. In all these API calls, with Node, a lot of times you want to just put null in that first spot because that's, if there was an exception, you would pass a reference to the exception in through the first argument. So the code, the implementation of done is going to look at that first argument first and say, if there's anything other than null in there, that means it didn't work, and that's an exception. That doesn't mean it's a wrong password, because that's not an exception. That's normal processing of the application. The user types it in wrong. So this first slot is only used for exceptions. And I'm not passing in any exception to done because I'm not hitting the database. But if I hit the database, that could generate an exception. That's the case. I'll have to have an if clause in there, conditional clause in there, a conditional statement in there. It checks for that error condition from the database, and then I would call done with error in the first position. So this is the normal case. So when you call done, it wants a user object. So we have to create the user object first. There it is. And that's whatever we want it to be. It's whatever it's not actually going to read that object. Okay? It never reads this user object. That's just for us. And now let's suppose that the username is not A and the password is not A. That means it's a bad login. So then we call done, and we pass in false as the second argument instead of passing in the user object. So the library is going to check for false, and then it may or may not use this information here. Actually, I haven't tried that. Let me do a bad. There's a bad password. Let's see what happens. No, nothing, right? So if I put a bad password in there, there's no message. So there's no message, and that was a login. But if we want this message to appear or some other message, then we got to add a little more code. So here's the session, and that's the session middleware. This is the URL encoded middleware. We talked about it before. We need to initialize the passport system, and then the result is passed in as middleware to the calling use on the app object. Same with the passport. I guess there's some kind of session handling middleware that passport needs registered. And this is the static file. This is where I get the CSS and the static objects. Now these are two functions that have to be provided to Passport to work correctly. It needs to know how to serialize a user and how to deserialize a user. So what does it mean to serialize a user? Well, you saw up here, I showed you the user object. Right here. That's the user object. So this user object is going to be stored in a cookie. And a cookie, the data that's storable in a cookie is basically characters. So we have to convert this user or Passport in order to put the information about this user object in the cookie. It needs to figure out how to convert this JavaScript object into text and embed that into the cookie that it sends to the browser. So we tell it, and that's called serialization, to convert this object into a string. It's called serialization. And Passport doesn't know how to do it because it's our user object. We're in charge of that thing. So we need to pass in a serializer function. Now I've got it highlighted right there. So when Passport needs to convert the user object to a string in order to insert it in the cookie, it's going to call this serializer function that we just defining here, and we're passing it into Passport. And what does the serializer object? What does the serializer function do? It takes a user object and a done function. And so the done that's the callback. It doesn't have to be called done. I mean, I don't know why I got it from the documentation. I usually use CB actually for callback. And so once we and that's this is Passport's callback function. That's its callback function that we need to call. So this callback function that Passport gives to us, the first argument is what? What is the first argument used for? Anybody want to tell me? Guess. It's for passing what? Nobody listening to me talk today. What is it for? The first argument. Typically in a Node application, when you're interacting with things that produce a lot of errors, like databases and things that can go wrong. So that's where you pass the exception. So you pass the error object through the first argument. So you want to pass in null normally, so to say that, oh, everything's all right, there's no exceptions. And then the second argument is the string. So I just took this user object here and passed it into stringify. And that's built into JavaScript, by the way. So this JSON object with stringify and parse. Parse is the opposite. So to deserialize, we're going to parse. And serialize, we're going to stringify. Stringify, turn it into a string. All right, and then here's the home page. / So we're going to register a request handler for the home page. And we're going to render through a template, poke template, the home template. And we're going to pass to that template the entire user object. Now look, see, when a request comes in for the home, where's the user object going to come from? We're passing a user object in to the template. Well, it's somehow attached to that request object. And the request object is passed in with whenever a request handler is invoked, it passes in the request object and a response object. So we get the request object, and the user object is attached as an attribute to this request object. Well, how did that get there? Who put it there? Well, we didn't put it there. That was Passport. Passport put it there. And it put it there using this middleware up here. See this? I don't know which one, but one of these. And so the passport middleware, before it lets our request handler run, it calls our deserializer function. Out of the cookie, the browser sends a cookie. It has the user object in it, but it's serialized. So Passport calls our deserialize function here, and we simply parse that string that it gives to us, and that produces the user object, the one that we had stringified up here. So Passport calls this deserializer function, well, this one in here, and then it gets the user object, constructs the user object that way, and then it attaches it to the request object for us to access. And it attaches it as a field named user. And then the middleware says, we're done, but we're not terminating processing of the request. We're going to, in the middleware, how you call the next function? Say, let the next middleware run. Let the next router run. And then the request comes to this handler eventually after passing through the Passport middleware. So let's take a look at that. There it is. See this? Here is the pug file. And this is where we dereference the username attribute of that user object, which we passed in to this pug template in that render method. So user.username. And that's it. That's how we got the user in there like that. All right, and then for when we post the form, the action is to send a request to /login with a method of post. All right, that means we have to register a handler for post methods that are sent to the /login URL. So what do we do? What we do is call this authenticate function. Let me just check that real quick here. So we call this authenticate function, and that generates this authenticate function. When we call it, this only runs once. It generates a request handler, and that request handler, where the call is right here, right? That's the entire call to authenticate. Authenticate returns a request handler, and that's what that request handler is then registered to respond to post requests coming in for /login. And when we call this authenticate method once in the lifetime of the app, we have to tell it what strategy to use, because we can have multiple strategies in the app. So we're using the local strategy. Remember, passport-local. And as a second argument, we have to pass in some configuration. We're going to tell it, the most important one is this failure redirect. You can leave out the success redirect if you want to implement that yourself. But if there's a failure, Passport, if we fail to authenticate, if the username and password, if the password is wrong or the username is wrong, that's a failure, and we're telling the Passport to redirect to the home page and the same location we redirect to in a success. So this is just temporary. That could be changed later on. And the logout is pretty simple. The request object has a logout function. How did that get there? It's not there normally. Passport put it there. Okay, now Passport added, where is it? Up here. Passport added a user object to the request object. It modified the request object, added that. It also modified the request object by adding a logout function. So we were going to call that. So it's convenience. And after we log out, and what this does is it sets up the conditions to, it deletes the session from the memory for the local session store. And then I think it probably does it, I don't think it deletes a cookie or anything like that. It might though, might delete a cookie. And then it redirects to the home page. That's it. I'm gonna write that, and that's pretty much it. I mean, that's it right there. You want to see a copy of this code? I could put this in the repository. You want to see it? Now let me stick it in the repository, and then I'm going to hand it over to Eric. So Eric, get ready there. I'll do that. Eric, why don't you get set up? I'm going to put that